So I had this idea for a video that came up in a conversation with my shrink, actually. We were talking about some videos that I had been making recently on this channel. We were talking about a video that I made of Wendi Adelson overanalyzing her testimony, and another one that I did about the celebration party. If you haven't seen those, check them out. And the Hare Psychopathy Checklist came up. It came up, actually, it came up because I was asking my psychiatrist about what he thought of the Hungry Like a Wolf paper by Hancock and a couple other authors. It's a really interesting paper that I referenced before on this channel in a video that I did about stand-up comedy. And the Hungry Like a Wolf paper is really interesting. It came out about, just over 10 years ago now. And the paper talks about how when they analyzed the language of psychopaths and doing interviews with killers, with murderers in jails, they took all the actual data, all the actual language from the interview and ran it through a program. And they were trying to find out what the difference was between the language that psychopathic and non-psychopathic murderers used to describe the day of their murders. And the strongest finding in the study was that murderers talked more about primary sense needs, like what they ate that day or drank that day. Thus the title of the paper, Hungry Like the Wolf. And I think that there's a couple of references that's making. I think one of the other major ones is the Diane Downs case, which is sort of replete with this sort of primary sense language when you listen to Diane Downs talk. But anyway, it's a really interesting paper, and they're really interesting researchers, and there's a great talk on YouTube that Jeff Hancock does talking about this paper. And so I asked my psychiatrist what he thought about it when, he basically indicated to me that a lot of these social science findings are, hard to replicate, and it's something that if I was really interested in, I should try to canvass the literature to see if there's anything else out there on it, and I need to do that still. But that he mentioned that, but anyway, as a result of this, the Hare Psychopathy Checklist came up, and we were talking about the validity of that, and there's been a couple of refinements of it over the years, but it's a checklist that was developed by a researcher named Dr. Robert Hare. It's like a list of about 20 questions that's used as a primary way to sort of gauge whether or not somebody might be a psychopath, and you can administer it yourself or to somebody that you're interviewing, or you can do it for yourself, self-report. When it's done in a professional setting, it's usually there's a whole protocol for it where you're supposed to do a whole long interview. But anyway, so the idea for this video came up as a result of that conversation where it was oh gosh, I was just doing all these videos on Wendi Adelson, and wouldn't she be interesting to run through this Hare Psychopathy Checklist? It's I haven't interviewed Wendi directly, and so this is just sort of and I'm obviously not a psychiatrist or a mental health professional. I have no credentials whatsoever. So as a caveat here, I'm just saying, this is just a fun little exercise. But I have actually listened to a ton of her testimony, so in a sense it's weird. I do have this voyeuristic sense that I have actually interacted with her a little bit. I feel like I do know her pretty well. I don't think I could do this checklist in a lot of cases because I haven't reviewed enough footage, but having actually heard Wendi on a podcast and in a couple other contexts, and then, in the ISOM interview for a few hours, and then on the stand in 3 different trials. I know those aren't perfect samples or exemplars, and it's hard to beat knowing her sort of before all this happened or something like that. But I do feel like I have at least enough of a basis to make this a fun exercise. And so I kind of looked around online for some other resources for this, and I found some really interesting stuff on the checklist and interviews with Dr. Robert Hare. He's a fascinating guy and has a lot of really interesting insights on psychopathy and how it's a really interesting disorder because it's one of the only disorders where the people that suffer from it, that have this disorder, can be sort of discriminated against. And it's just a really interesting one because the way that we sort of treat psychopaths and deal with them in society is such a thorny question, and I don't think that it's something that we've really thoughtfully addressed in our society at all. It's just one of those things that sort of gets swept under the rug because it's such a difficult thing to try to deal with in a fair way. But the other thing I was going to say is the Hungry Like a Wolf thing is really interesting in the Adelson case as well, because I mentioned it, as I said, in a video that I did about stand-up comedy. It's sort of a goof satire thing about how I think stand-up comics are all psychopaths, and I kind of go through this evidence citing this Hungry Like a Wolf study and the fact that the topics of stand-up comedy are all about primary sense stuff like food. How many stand-up bits can you think about that are about food, like Hot Pockets or KFC famous bowls. Anyway, that's the bit. But when you look at the Dan Markel murder in the context of the Hungry Like a Wolf paper, it's actually kind of scary, and I'm not the only one that noticed it. The other really interesting thing about that is within, I think, a week, actually trying to want to confirm this because I'm really interested about the chronology of this now. I cited that in this thing I had been working on for a long time, this video on stand-up comedy that I published, and I think within about a week of that, and maybe I think Fancy might have published her thing before me, but Fancy Fiction released a video also citing this same study, Hungry Like a Wolf, and how it relates to this case. So I thought that was really interesting. It's great minds think alike, Fancy. I really like her content. She is one of the authorities on this case. So I just thought that was really interesting. When I saw that, I was like shocked. I left a comment on the video. I had to dig this up because it's been a while since I've seen it. But yeah, I mean, when you think about how Wendi described that day and the way that she sort of set everything up, like from the television stuff to the lunch date to the bullet bourbon, like even like Wendi seems to talk about so much about like food and primary sense stuff. One of the weird, I don't know, there's just like every time she talks about food at all, it kind of creeps me out. Like there's this one clip where she's describing the kosher rules and how she describes, it's like a rule against the mixing of milk and meat, and my mind is just like so preoccupied when she's thinking about the Hungry Like a Wolf study, because the way that she says it's just really creepy and weird. It's such a creepy clip.
Sure. It's a separation of milk from meat. So you couldn't have a cheeseburger, for example, right? You couldn't have milk with a meat product. And the meat has to be killed in a ritual-specific way that's been blessed by a rabbi.
So anyway, I dug around. I found some great interviews with Dr. Robert Hare, the guy who developed the psychopathy checklist, and some of the things that he says about psychopaths are, shall we say, revealing in light of this case.
A psychopath is also a grandiose individual, has a very powerful sense of self, believes that he or she is the center of the universe, better, smarter than everybody else. The psychopath is also very manipulative, tends to manipulate, con, and deceive other people to try and mold them into something that they can use. Remember, the psychopath is really a predator, and as a predator, you're trying to groom and put your prey in the right position for where you can make some use of this particular object, is the way they would see them.
And the other thing that I found that was really great is I found a Wendigoon video who was doing like a similar thing he was running through serial killers, and he was running them through this psychopath checklist as he was making a serial killer iceberg video. Wendigoon's like a really popular YouTuber who does stuff on conspiracy and true crime topics, but he found a really good online questionnaire, which is really helpful so I don't have to sort of construct this thing myself, which I'll be using in this as we run Wendi through the psychopathy checklist. And it's really interesting and good resource. I'll link it if you want to try it to test yourself or your friends. And I found that it was like a really interesting exercise. Like some online tests that you can take are just kind of, I don't know, not very rigorous or well put together. But this one I thought was worth the exercise. There's something really interesting about people that like to take online tests as well. Like I don't know why, I think this might have come up in like the Tony Todd murder case, the Family Annihilator case, but there's just something about the way like people that take IQ tests and enjoy doing that and like find random websites where they can like cheat on an IQ test to like feel like a genius or something. It's like a character trait that probably should be on one of these psychopathy test checklists, but like, so I guess what I'm saying is I don't have like a ton of experience using these online tests, but this one seemed like a pretty good one. And so there's a link in the description if you want to try it yourself. And I always try to put links in the description to other stuff, so always worth checking down there. And it's always worth subscribing if you want to keep in touch with the channel. Got a lot of new interesting stuff coming up on not just the Adelson case, but also on just other true crime topics, other stuff that strikes my fancy. So really I'm so close to 1,000 subscribers. That's such a crazy milestone that I'd love to achieve. So please subscribe and and leave a comment if you have some interesting thoughts to share. There's a few things that'll come up here in this checklist that'll be interesting, or it'll be really interesting to read what people have to share about their thoughts, because like there's some of these things that are very debatable about whether or not how the question should be answered for Wendi. Some of them I think are very obvious, but this was really fun. So we'll get into I think it's about 20 or 21 questions here in the psychopathy checklist for Wendi. So that the way that these are numbered on the website's a little funky, because like the first question on the website is, are you taking this test for yourself or for others? So the numbering is, I'll just use the numbering on the website, but it's like the first question is going to be question number 2 instead of question number 1, because question number 1 is like, are you taking this test for yourself or for somebody else? So the first question on the psychopathy checklist is, the person has broken many different types of laws, i.e. their law-breaking behavior has not been restricted to any single domain, such as sexual, financial, or similar. This person has broken many different types of laws. Okay. So I think this is pretty safely a yes. And let me explain at this point the way that this test is scored. As you can see here, there's 3 different options for answering these, and you can either choose, it's rated on a 3-point scale, which the rating of 0 if it doesn't apply at all, 1 if it's a partial match or mixed information or if you're not sure, and 2 if it's like a reasonably good match, if you think that this applies very well to the defender. So it's a 3-point scale basically. 0 if it doesn't apply, 1 if it's partial or mixed, and 2 if it's a good match. Okay? So thinking about this, I think that that this is if I was choosing between the 3, I think this is probably in the 3rd category, applies well, because we know that Wendi ultimately was cool with killing Dan Markel, right? I mean, that's the other thing, is I guess we should just make the assumption here that Wendi's guilty. I mean, I think it's so hard to argue that Wendi is not complicit in the conspiracy to kill Dan Markel, so we're just going to take that as an assumption in this exercise. I know that she hasn't been charged or convicted, so I want to make that clear, but we're just, for the sake of this exercise, we're just going to assume that she was involved in the conspiracy. So that's 1, and I think if that was the only thing ever that we could really think about that Wendi's ever done that could run afoul of the law, then maybe this would be like a mixed, I guess. But this, I think, is the thing about murder is I think it's a very serious, bright line law. I'd say it's in a different class of crime, which means you're willing to do all sorts of lesser crimes, and it also probably means that it's got to be vanishingly rare that the only crime somebody's ever been guilty of is murder. I mean, how many times is people get away with stuff a lot of times before they get caught. We all sort of understand this. And putting this another way, does anybody really think that Wendi is like the type of person to do the right thing when nobody's watching? And the other thing is, like, we don't know like a ton about Wendi, and we'll sort of talk about this a little bit more as we get into these questions. We don't have that many great sources on Wendi. I mean, we have a few that are pretty good, but from the few sources that we do have, we know that Wendi was alleged to have withheld assets in the divorce with Dan, and Dan Markel alleged that she had basically acted in bad faith in a lot of their dealings in the divorce, and there's a lot of different things you could discuss there. Wendi also, I think, displayed a really casual disregard for the rule of law by doing stuff like telling a lot of different people the hitman joke. Like, you don't really joke around like that if you are a goody two-shoes and respect the rule of law. There's a lot of things like that are sort of circumstantial things that aren't, they don't directly show that Wendi has broken laws, but they show that her attitude towards the law is such that it's pretty clear that she doesn't mind breaking the law. And the other thing is, if you look at her family of origin, this Adelson family who wield political influence, which is all about like not following the law, like, you being above the law or bending the law. And also the Adelson family was in all sorts of sleaze, like doing stuff to help Charlie out of his jam in dental school. And the other thing that I thought of when kind of going through this in my mind is that, like, the first thing that Charlie thought that the bump was looking into is actually financial. His first thought in one of those wires is the first thing he brings up is, was it the IRS?
Did Dad know about it? The dad didn't work for it, fortunately. What's is it IRS? Those IRS people that kind of obvious sometimes, but fortunately not now.
And that to me the tons of cash, the safe full of different piles of money, with different family members, piles of money, and Charlie and Wendi being alleged to have their own piles of money in this family safe. I mean, they operate like a crime family. So this is a full yes for me. This applies very well. So yeah, I thought that this is a pretty interesting exercise just to go through for myself anyway, I think sometimes it's good to do these exercises where you start from fundamentals and just sort of go through at least the exercise to yourself to think about the level of culpability. And I thought this was just a really revealing exercise, and we're only on question 1. So so that's question 1. I'm trying to think, should I go with that's such an annoying thing that the first question on the test is, we'll just go with the actual test number because it'll be on the screen. So this is question 3, the second actual question after identifying if you're doing this for yourself or for somebody else. The person is overly impulsive. So for this one, I think we really want to talk about Jeffrey Lacoste and how he's such a unique and insightful witness here. I think I mentioned this a little bit in another video, but I think it's so rare to have somebody with Professor Lacoste's skill set involved in a case. And I've looked at Professor Lacoste's CV a couple times, and I pulled it up again just to look through the type of stuff that this guy's involved in his work life. This guy's like a professor of social work, so he understands these sort of issues of psychology better than 99.9% of people on earth. So he's in such a unique position to be able to see what's going on here, and so I think his insights are so interesting. So just looking over his CV really quickly, you can see that he's been a professor in social work since he's been a PhD since 2008, so 16 years, and he's been a associate professor since 2018, assistant professor since 2013 or since 2008. So yeah, he's been a lecturer before that. I mean, he's just gotten a really long and varied CV. A lot of stuff in his coursework, a lot of stuff about theories of models and sort of the meta-analysis of stuff on meds, psychiatry meds, drug withdrawal, stuff on drugs and using and prescribing drugs in these type of settings, human sexuality, social welfare, policies and programs. So he's been involved in doctoral committees, master committees chair, and he's also got a really interesting publication record as well. His journal articles, Social Work Research in a Crisis, as a most recent publication, Measuring the Impact of the Child and Adolescent Social Work Journal, New York Times and the ADHD Epidemic, After DSM-5, Critical Mental Health Research Agenda. So these are, really interesting sort of larger 30,000 feet view topics. Medical ghostwriting, a university-sanctioned academic sleight of hand. It's really interesting. There's a couple of different articles that he's written about medical ghostwriting. Why does academic medicine allow ghostwriting, a prescription for reform? So this is a guy that's very thoughtful and has some really sort of structural arguments about the way that things are done. I mean, this is a pretty high level thinker is what this evinces to me. I'm not obviously super knowledgeable about any of these topics, but then you look at his referee journal articles, and it's just thinking about these in terms of even going. I mean, the stuff that he's been working on since is also sort of revealing in that you think that what he was interested in working on had to have been influenced by this case, but clinical depression, psychiatric prescribing and child welfare. Yeah, so just lots of stuff about the reform of the way that we prescribe and use and misuse of statistics. Experiences of child welfare workers regarding psychotropic medications, results from a mixed method evaluation of critical medication curriculum. So yeah, it's just a really big high-level overviews about the way we prescribe drugs. And that was, in around 2020 that paper's out. So just kind of going backwards a little bit, I'm just kind of interested in seeing what he was working on in around 2014. Go down here, let's see, the role of services in mental health recovery, qualitative examination of service experiences among individuals diagnosed with serious mental illness. So again, sort of a high-level overview. Narrating the brain, investigating competing portrayals of the embodiment of mental disorder. God, that's fascinating. 2014, right around that time. So this is I wish I was more educated in being able to sort of glean what these means, but like it seems like there are a lot of articles that are about process and how we think about medicine, sort of like meta-analyses. And lots of stuff about like, mental disorder. And so, I mean, this is a guy that knows like the DSM backwards and forwards and would be able to pretty acutely diagnose what he was seeing in Wendi. And there's a number of different things that like the stuff that he says about his, how he had to go to a therapist and that therapist suggesting to him that Wendi may have been a psychopath is really interesting, because it goes to show you like the level of, how Jeff Lacoste must have been almost like overwhelmed at a certain point. I mean, I can understand that, how it's sort of hard to see things for yourself, even if you're highly trained in them. And it also kind of goes to show that Jeff Lacoste is knowledgeable of his own faults and is willing to take info and feedback from others, and in fact seeks out second and third opinions on things to sort of make sure that he's seeing past his own biases. And in fact, he even brings that up in the stuff with ISOM. It's really kind of fascinating. I mean, how often do you see like a witness citing, like understanding that sort of level of like what their own biases are and like trying to correct for that? I mean, that's pretty wild stuff.
All of a sudden, she throws me the world. And if all at the time I said to my friends, I've been very careful not to develop like a hindsight bias. I've checked back in with my friends. What did I say? They said, you said in June it felt like Wendi was stringing you along for some reason. And you couldn't figure out why didn't you just break up with you? She's like, this ain't gonna work,
So that's all to say that like Jeff Lacoste had some really interesting things to say about like how impulsive Wendi was and how it changed over time too. There's a lot of different really interesting interpretations you can try to make about that, because Jeff at some point has a really interesting quote about how Wendi seemed to get worse over time at hiding her dirt from him. Here's some quote about how he says something like, it's interesting, like, at first she was really good at hiding stuff. I'm going to find that quote and put it here because I think it's a good baseline.
But just to remind you, I just walked into All Saints Coffee and there's my girlfriend with another guy. But that was a big deal in our relationship. And
right, because you see her there and she's with this guy and
yeah.
And you don't know who the guy is. If maybe I got that wrong. You knew that she was seeing a guy?
Well, that's one of the things that concerned me, is that she would bring him up from time to time. And there was other signs. I mean, there's, I think, 5 to 10 other men. I was in denial about it in this time period. That's not a crime, obviously, but she's very impulsive, very erratic, doesn't think things through. She will do them and then worry about the consequences later. She was remarkably sloppy about cheating on me in terms of, that's what was interesting. Up until about early June, she was covering her tracks pretty well, actually.
And so Jeffrey Lacoste had noted at some point something along the lines that like Wendi also showed poor impulse control, and we can see that like the hallmark, I think, to me, the thing that first comes to mind, leaps to mind, is that Wendi drove by the crime scene, right? I mean, that's so impulsive. I mean, that really says it all. It's interesting trying to like think about like what was driving her into such an emotional frenzy that did she like have to know what was happening, or like was she just so anxious, or was it like she needed some control, or was it like a thing where she, there's also people that have theories that like she wanted to be the person that discovered his body. There's a lot of different really interesting ways to try to interpret that. If it was just the one thing, if it was just like Wendi going to the crime scene and like there could be a couple different interpretations of it, it might be like, yeah, I don't know if she's necessarily impulsive or she just did something dumb that one time. But then there's all these different incidents where she tells Jeff Lacoste all this damning information. And also in the interview with ISOM, where she within minutes, she's telling the family, or she's telling about the hitman joke and about how, her brother Charlie said that he was thinking about hiring a hitman. And she has a case of like not being able to shut up at certain points. It's just really interesting. It's interesting though. And as we get further into these questions, we sort of are going to parse this a little bit more, but Wendi at times seems like she's better at controlling her impulses than others. others. And sometimes she seems like she has like pretty excellent self-control. Like said she was the valedictorian of her high school, and I think she graduated with honors from college. I mean, whatever, she passed the bar if she went to law school. I mean, she's inarguably sharp as a student, right? But then she's also sloppy with two-timing Jeff. And there's also another fascinating snippet where Jeffrey Lacoste talks about how Wendi got worse at scheming over time. And one thing that I thought about after sitting with this for a while is that like maybe Wendi got worse because she was juggling more and more balls in the air as she got close to the murder. Like it wasn't, I think we'll talk about this more in some other questions, but I think that she was seeing more people than just Jeff Lacoste at the time. So maybe as she got closer to the crime, like there's just so many different things that she had going on that like that's maybe why she seemed like more impulsive and sloppy. But anyway, this one I think is obviously like a full she's overly impulsive. I'm gonna say that applies very well again, so we'll answer that one. Okay, question number 4. The person is callous and or lacks empathy. I mean This is just a smash hit. Yeah, I mean, there's really no way to argue this. The way that Wendi is able to shuffle people around and use them and discard them is so telling. The entire nature of the crime of the murder of Dan Markel exhibits, whoever arranged this, it has a heart of darkness. I mean, that's so clear. And I think it was in part Wendi, in part Donna. I mean, I think that there was a couple different catalysts for it, but Wendi had to have been okay with it, with eliminating Danny Markel, which just shows that she felt entitled to make the ultimate decision about life and death for somebody else. When most people are met with somebody in their life that they can't stand, their mind, doesn't go to murder. It just, I don't know, on some level to me when thinking about like how Wendi would even think that she could do this, it just seems so presumptuous and I don't know, distasteful or something. It's just so like, it's just such a shitty thing to do. I mean, let's just be real. And on another level, it also just feels like somebody's so unstable and willing to burn the whole house down because they don't like the wallpaper. I mean, that's what it seems like, right? It's just so stupid, so short-sighted. And so there's just so many different people, thinking about whether or not Wendi's callous and lacks empathy. Everybody was pawns in Wendi's game. As Jeffrey said, Wendi enjoyed mind games. She was like a cat playing with a mouse in her interactions with Jeff Lacoste at times. She overwhelmed his senses with love bombing, right? She maneuvered people around like her helper in the police interview, who she had been gassing up with all these stories of Jeffrey Lacoste being a jealous lover. So her support person would then suggest Jeffrey Lacoste as a suspect by proxy, right? I mean, this is another obvious applies well. Question 5. This person has a history of exhibiting cruelty to others. I mean, come on. This is another slam dunk. It has me sort of thinking about, though, like who else Wendi was in relationships with at the time. This is something that I'd really be interesting to sort of puzzle through all the info and the cases to try to put together, because we only really heard from Jeffrey Lacoste on this, and I think it even dawned on Jeffrey Lacoste at one point in an interview that he very well may be the only objective source out there on Wendi, as no one outside her family had ever really spent, I think he says something like over 100 hours with her. There's a really interesting clip that I'll play here where he's like, I think I'm in some other guy is like the only person that really knows about her. And I think when that dawns on him, I think it kind of freaks him out a little bit, because he realizes that like that is pretty dangerous info to have, right?
Well, I guess one of the things I worry about is Wendi has this public persona, and she's a very good actress, and she's very charismatic and all this kind of stuff. And she knows a lot of people. Everybody in Tallahassee knows Wendi. You probably discovered that already. I mean, she's in every social circle. She's very social butterfly-esque and out there and stuff. But in terms of people that know her intimately, have spent like a lot of time with her and seen behind the curtain, I think it's Markel, me, and maybe that Sack guy in the last 12, 13 years. I mean, she doesn't, you know what I mean? So.
And so, like, just thinking about like who else would actually know, like, Wendi well, like outside of her family unit. I mean, there's the Dave guy that from the phone calls, but I think that's after the murder. And Dave doesn't seem like he was super long term, but I don't know the details of that relationship offhand. And then Jeffrey Lacoste, and then Danny Markel's obviously out of the picture, right? We can't really hear from him and everything and she had an obvious history of being cruel to Danny before the murder with all the divorce stuff and withholding the kids and trying to make it out like Danny was being abusive and all this sort of stuff. I mean, Jesus. The point is that we don't have much of a sample size, but like it's not very statistically safe to be dating Wendi Adelson, is it? Right? I mean, either you get murdered, you're liable to get killed by a hitman, or be set up for same, right? I mean, you're gonna have to deftly work your way out of a booby trap if you're gonna be dating Wendi Adelson. So That's another full send. Question 6. The person is a pathological liar. This is another one that I just want to rubber stamp and move on, but I am trying to linger on these a little bit and just see if there's any finer points to bring out. And also just to make sure that my assessment is reasonable and not too clouded by my dislike of Wendi. I just want to also just sort of make sure, like, is there anything that's countervailing evidence here? The clips where Wendi lies about stuff like knowing how to spell gibbers are pretty damning on this score.
Was sort of a nickname I gave him to make him feel less threatening.
So it was a derogatory thing.
I wouldn't say it was derogatory.
Did you call him that to his face?
No, I called him Danny to his face.
Okay.
And gibbers would be what? How would you spell that?
I don't know that I ever spelled it out. In the emails, I think it's spelled with a J, but I guess you could spell it with a G.
Jibbers.
That would be one way to
Ms.
spell it.
Adelson, you had Mr. Markel's phone number programmed into your phone as Jibbers, didn't you?
That's right.
Pathological is about lying about, big and little stuff, right? And the stuff where she's like lying about knowing what the punishment for contempt could be, that could involve jail, and she's an attorney and doesn't know that, or lying about not remembering stuff in her divorce and not hating Tallahassee, or just indefensible, if you want to try to, I'm trying to also like bring in the defense for Wendi here and like trying to think of what those arguments would be. And it's like, what would you even say to defend Wendi here, right? Like even the biggest Wendi simp is going to have to admit that she is an inveterate liar. As I was thinking through this, it reminded me of the Claudine Gay fiasco, where Claudine Gay was recently fired as president of Harvard for plagiarism and for other charges of not condemning anti-Semitism. But the plagiarism incident was interesting to me because people really sort of focused in on certain things that she'd plagiarized, and she'd, done some sort of garden variety plagiarism, but then she also plagiarized stuff like in her acknowledgments to colleagues and loved ones. Like she stole phrasing in those things where it just showed this vivid sense of who this person, Claudine Gay, was, that she was utterly hollow. She didn't have enough of an idea about herself to even summon the words to thank her professors or fellow students or loved ones. She didn't even have that sort of creative spark, and that just sort of reminds me a lot of Wendi. Like she's an empty suit. There's no there. Wendi is not some brilliant legal mind or great writer. She's, she wrote a turgid self-insert fantasy and has accomplished precisely nothing based on her own merit, and she's lied her way through all of it. So this is another applies very well. Not looking great for Miss Wendi. Question 7. This person displays a lack of remorse or guilt. It seems like there's a decent amount of overlap here, but again, this one's like a grooved fastball right down the middle of the plate. It is interesting. I mean, Wendi does display like some sense of guilt. Jeffrey Lacoste, the thing that I thought of, is noted that she appeared to be crying to herself in the weeks leading up to the murder. So Wendi was processing something. I thought about like what this was that she was actually thinking. I mean, it'd be so fascinating to have that sort of insight, because it could be that she was dealing with her own internal anxiety, and it wasn't that she was really dealing with feelings of guilt necessarily, but just like whether or not she was going to get away with it, and just sort of that. I mean, who knows? It's tough to say, but even if she was like a full-blown psychopath, she has to have some sort of feeling, I think, right? So I'd say that this one applies very well, but it's like a 7 of 8 out of 10 rather than like a 9 or 10 out of 10 like some of these other answers. And that's just my gut feeling. Hopefully that makes sense, but also would like to, obviously, for all of these questions, would be love to hear your input on how you judge this one. I mean, this one is, I could sort of be swayed a couple different ways, but I think it's either like huge slam dunk or slightly less huge slam dunk that this applies very well. Question 8. This person has a grandiose sense of self-worth. This is an easy yes, right? No doubt. Whereas with the previous question, I'm confident, but like not like slam dunk. This one is so evident. This one's like the Vince Carter slam dunk from like the 2000 dunk contest, like elbow through the rim dunk. Definitely Wendi has a grandiose sense of self-worth. To me, like the most telling stuff is from the book This Is Our Story that Wendi wrote way back in the day when she was still married, where there was like some level of plausible deniability built in that book. So she, that's why it's like a self-insert where you can kind of get away with I don't know, sort of unloading your psyche in a book or something. But the way that she depicted Lily Lily, aka Wendy's, feelings for her clueless husband was so telling in this regard. And also how like Wendy/Lily was such an angel on earth put here to bless the less fortunate and care and compassion, but like also the way that she takes like her client's baby, despite that being sort of fuzzy in terms of the ethical implications of taking on your client's child, adopting them. But like I don't know, I haven't even read the books, and I don't want to, but just from what I've heard about it, it's just so, I don't know, so stunningly revolting, and just shows like a wild level of self-regard, that she sort of sees herself as this ethereal being, and that we all should be so lucky to be in her presence, basically. And you know, she's also the kind of person that uses her children as props, or uses her kids to get back at her ex. I also just sort of thought about like her evil little cackle when she made that comment about how she's never going to be arrested is so telling. I mean, she just thinks she's blameless and put upon and a victim, but also she's a singular talent who's been badly misunderstood. I mean, I really do think that she has a wildly inflated sense of self-worth. So that one's another full applies. Number 9, the person generally evades responsibility and does not answer to anyone in their life. It's really unreal how well these questions describe Wendi, right? I mean, yes, of course. Even Wendy's biggest boosters, again, her family, they bitch about how Wendi has never had to lift a finger and has never had to be responsible or accountable. Charlie's references to Wendi as like a trust fund situation really say it all. That conversation between Charlie and Donna is so revealing about the whole family dynamic. I mean, it says so much about Charlie just being like this greasy guy that loves to hear himself talk, and it says so much about Donna that just the stuff that like she's okay with, and also the stuff that she says, and the whole, I don't know, it's just such a revolting situation, that whole family. But the way that they regard her is very revealing, and they, you know, it just shows that they can actually see her for who she is, even though they're like delusional about a lot of other stuff. They are fully aware of how much of a Jewish American princess stereotype Wendi is. I mean, she really embodies that stereotype, and it makes it take on like a much darker and more toxic subtext given the association. So it's just, yeah, I don't know.
It's a double-edged sword. It's like when you give your kid a trust fund, then you wonder how come they don't want to go to medical school and deal with all the bullshit, the lawyers and the aggravation and the nonsense of medicine in 2016.
But yeah, full apply. Question 10. This person has an easy or unconstrained social style. This one's interesting because it does seem to apply to Wendi, but it's not like entirely negative. I mean, Wendi is very skillful socially. And again, the ever insightful Jeffrey Lacoste has some good quotes about how Wendi has this amazing social grace. And, you know, he even says some language that sort of tipped me that, like, you know, it was typical of a sociopath to have this sort of, I think he even says something like glib or shallow social bonding style. And Wendi knew a lot of people, but very few people well. I think this one's an obvious, again, applies very well. And there's a very interesting Jeffrey Lacoste quote on this one, too.
You talk a little fast for me.
I'm sorry.
100 hours.
Yeah, first 100 hours you think she's amazing. Then after that, wait a second, there's some tremendous flaws here. So she puts up a very good public face.
Question 11. The person has had many serious romantic relationships that have fallen apart after a short time. This might be our first partial, but I think it's close. The word many is the sticking point for me. This person has had many serious romantic relationships that have fallen apart after a short time. I think it's yes, though, because we know that Wendi was juggling a few guys, right, at the time of Dan Markel's murder. There was the guy in South Florida that Jeffrey Lacoste suspected, and at least one guy there, right? There's also the guy that Wendi was meeting in Tallahassee at the coffee shop that Lacoste stumbled into, right? And there's also, I've also said that there's at least another couple side pieces that we don't know about, right? Like there's two that Jeff is pretty sure about. It means there's probably at least a couple others, right? So she might have been in like 4 or 5 relationships at that time, right? And a lot of them she dropped, right, you know, around the time of the murder for various reasons. And that's also, like I said earlier, where Jeff mentioned, that Wendi seemed to be getting worse at hiding stuff. Well, maybe she was juggling like so many side pieces and other pieces to the plot. Maybe she's doing other stuff that, to prepare for the murders. God knows what else she was up to. Probably packing up the house, doing all sorts of stuff. And there's also probably unsuccessful versions of Jeffrey Lacoste where she was trying to get into relationships to try to maneuver people into position like she was with Lacoste, but it wasn't successful. I mean, had to be false starts, right? And other versions of him. So yeah, this applies very well as I thought through it, and I think it's also specifically tied to how Wendi engineered relationships to happen and to fall apart, and a few of them to coincide with the murder. The other thing that's really interesting is like as in a few different points, like as you listen to Jeffrey Lacoste talking about the relationship, there's a few different points where he says stuff like, we had decided this or we had decided that, and you're like, oh, this was Wendi deciding. Like Wendi was so in charge of how that thing went down, but she was also like adroit enough socially that she was able to convince even somebody like the real high level guy like Jeffrey Lacoste, that like we had made these decisions together when it was so obviously Wendi who was in charge, who was manipulating everything, right? So that's another, I think, full apply. 12. This person has at some point in their life been given a mild reprimand or warning by the authorities on the condition that they not repeat their offense, yet nevertheless ended up repeating the offense anyway. This one is interesting to think about, but I think that Wendi's never really been in trouble. I guess in the context of the divorce litigation, Wendi did ignore a court's order to like return Markel's property, including the Holocaust ring. So I don't think that Wendi would take a court's order seriously. Yeah, Wendi's not the type of person who like thanks their lucky stars they got away with cooking the books in an audit, and then from then on always pays their taxes in full, right? This family gives zero shits about the law. I'm saying this applies very well. This person at some point has been given a mild, yeah, this applies very well. 13. The person lacks realistic long-term goals, i.e. either drifting through life or chasing grandiose schemes that fail to pan out. This is another one that's debatable. On the one hand, Wendi is definitely able to make a long-term plan with her ability to like move people around on the chessboard and plot a murder by proxy. The counter, I guess, would be that her planning isn't really realistic at some level in terms of like what extent Wendi is really propelled forward by her own momentum. I think this is actually our first applies partially because Wendi is skilled at manipulating towards a long-term goal, but professionally she hasn't distinguished herself and she hasn't been able to really find her thing in life other than really being into teacher-student erotica. So this one is pretty unclear to me. I would love to hear your takes in the comments, but I'm going to say this one applies partially. So our first applies partially, 14. This person has an excessive need for stimulation and is prone to boredom. I will say that Wendi doesn't seem to be addicted to posting and getting validation on social media. So in that respect, she seemingly eschewed that very common vice. But there is also just a thread on the Dan Markel subreddit about how Wendi has a bot army monitoring posts there, and there are constant rumors about her and the Adelsons astroturfing on social media. So it's sort of debatable about to what extent she's online. The other thing I think about here is like drug and alcohol abuse, the excessive need for stimulation and prone to boredom. That's a big factor, is whether or not they abuse drugs and alcohol. And Wendi's family does seem to have some potential issues, like the mom, Donna, and Harvey and Charlie too, also seem like they were sort of pill poppers. And there were many references on The Wire to taking Xanax. And those friggin' benzos are so dangerous. It's probably the worst drug to be dependent on in my mind. Some of the worst long-term withdrawal stories about benzos are terrifying. So then again, we always have the always relevant Professor Lacoste's insight into how Wendi would also drink her dinners. I thought that was one of the more revealing things that I wish he had talked more about, is her use of alcohol and possibly drugs. I wonder if she wasn't also popping pills herself, Wendi. The devil is in the word excessive, though. An excessive need for stimulation and prone to boredom. And compared to a lot of people, I'd say that Wendi's probably pretty average in this regard. I mean, it's hard to sort of read the tea leaves too much there, so I'm going to say applies partially here. She does seem like she is prone to boredom given how much a bore she is, and she's basically waiting around her whole life for people to serve her and for opportunities for her to look smart, which are so rare that she freaks out when she can't take advantage, like when she was bitching about how she couldn't do a commencement speech because of Dan's death and how it would look. But I don't know. I'm just going to say this one applies partially, but I could easily be talked into something else here, so let me know in the comments on that one. 15. The person has a history of juvenile delinquency and or crime. I would be so fascinated to know if there were any incidents in Wendy's youth where she got into trouble, but it seems like she was super sheltered and helicopter parented. I think Wendi made a reference at some point to not having lost her virginity during at least high school, maybe even college. She comes across as like super goody two-shoes on some level, like in terms of like school stuff, I guess. But those kind of people can also have like real problems that don't even emerge until later in life. I have this weird sort of pet hypothesis about people who don't try drugs for the first time until later in life, like after their early 20s or something, will have like a higher chance to become a problem addict than people who had first use at like a normal time, like in their mid-teens. I know that there are like terrible stats for people who use drugs like super young, but I've just known of like enough instances where somebody who like never used drugs and then tried like a line of coke in their 30s and then just like everything falls apart. Like that exact story has played out a couple of times to people I know, and it's so mystifying. So I'm just saying, like, you know, people can have those sort of issues at lots of different points in life, and I would not be surprised at all if Wendi was like a klepto or something like that. We didn't really know about it, but I can't really think of anything to point to outside of the Markel case, like history of juvenile delinquency or crime. Like, what do we know about Wendi that was really what was she really, what do we know that she was up to when she was younger that was like salacious at all? In fact, Wendi really reminds me of two different girls I went to high school with, and this is actually something I really want to make a video about someday. I have like some notes on it, but something I've been trying to unpack for a lot of years. But both of these girls were a lot like Wendi in that they were really smart and high achieving, and both of them were involved in like super charitable stuff. Like on their Facebook, you would see stuff where they would, you know, they'd be the type of people who like went to missions in Africa for something like Habitat for Humanity or something, or just were involved with like causes, right? And both of them ended up getting in trouble like in their late 20s or early 30s, around there, for embezzling large sums of money from people close to them and using money in part to do like this super goody two-shoes stuff, right? So like this kind of weird Robin Hood theory type, I don't even know how to describe it, but it's I guess what I'm saying is like I'm a little bit wary of like super like on the surface trying to look like a goody two-shoes, but I think this one does not apply because I just don't have enough info. Like it could apply, I wouldn't be surprised, but I just don't have like a better handle on it. But this is the thing, is like I learn stuff about this case like all the time, and there's some people in this case that are like incredible authorities, so I know that people will have other stuff in the comments, but this one I'm just gonna have to say does not apply because I don't and I don't know, I guess I wouldn't be surprised at all if Wendi had done crimes, but she's never really gotten in trouble for it. So I don't know, I guess you could easily say that this one could be like a mixed, but I'm just going to go with does not apply because I just want to be as fair as I possibly can. And I know there's an argument, but I'd love to hear why I'm wrong. I don't know, I could easily be talked out of this one too. Number 16, the person has poor behavioral controls and finds it hard to keep their impulses in check. This one is very similar to a previous question, similar to question 3. This person is overly impulsive. I'd say this one applies very well. There's some evidence to Marshall on the other side of the equation, so it's not, again, like a Shaquille O'Neal backboard breaking slam dunk here, but I think it's hard to argue no. For one thing, Wendi isn't on the wire like Charlie and Donna. She does have the ability to stick to a plan and be disciplined. But not talking to Charlie and Donna on the phone isn't really something Wendi cares about. So like when Wendi wants something, it makes it a lot harder for her to not say, drive to the murder scene or fill the silence with incriminating babble, like all the damning stuff she said to Jeffrey Lacoste. So in other words, marshmallow test only works if you like marshmallows, right? So I'd say this one applies very well. 17. The person has a history of promiscuous sexual behavior. I think this is a pretty clear applies partially because Wendi can be promiscuous in some sense, but she was also apparently fairly chaste, fairly late into life, so I don't really want to dwell on this, so let's just call it partial. Moving on. 18. The person has often tricked, conned, and or manipulated people. Yeah, this one's a huge slam dunk. There's really nothing to say. I mean, of course. 19. The person lives like a parasite on others, e.g. by borrowing money they will never pay back, cynically exploiting others for favors, etc. The financial shenanigans in the divorce, again, is a contributing factor to me wanting to say it applies at least somewhat here, right? Wendi was trying to gobble up all the GoFundMe money, and also she's living off the ill-gotten gains of the life insurance payouts and the Social Security from the late ex-husband she made late, and it's really revolting, and this is why this is another slam, right? Anyway, plus the way that Wendi abuses the goodwill and trusting nature of her friends, the few that still sort of silently abet her, is so goddamn greasy. Yeah, this applies perfectly.
Oh, that's greasy. That's really fucking greasy. Yeah, it's greasy.
21. The person is characterized by shallow emotional responses. Yeah, Wendi doesn't have much emotional range, right? She's basically either pleased with herself or not happy. And so everyone around her needs to do everything in their power to make her happy again, right? The wheel. Wendi and her mother before her are emotional vampires, right? They prey on chaos and whisper campaigns, personal, professional character assassinations. You are either with them or against them, right? No subtlety, no depth to the emotional character of the Adelson family. They really are a picture of greed and arrogance and a lack of curiosity about the world outside, of how they can make money to acquire more status symbols, right? Everything is shallow appearances. So yeah, applies perfectly. I'm really having fun doing this. I don't know. This feels almost like cathartic. Like I should do one of these like every week about somebody I don't like. Maybe once a month. We'll sort of back it off. I could become addicted to making these videos very easily. 22. The last question, and then we'll get to the results. Should be fun. The person has a habit of blaming others for their own problems and does not accept responsibility for their own actions. I laughed so much to myself when I first read this. I mean, yeah, 1,000,000 yeses, right? 1,000,000,000 yeses. This applies. Let's punch it in and take a look at the results, folks. Okay, the person you attempted to rate is 88% total psychopathy score. The person you rated is 78.5% more psychopathic than the average person. This person qualifies as a psychopath on the psychopathy checklist. Oh well. So they're 88% total psychopath, so well above the little red line psychopathy checklist or psychopathy threshold. 100% on psychopathic interpersonal style. Well, 75% on psychopathic lifestyle. 88% on overt antisocial features, and 88% for total score. Explanation of factors. Psychopathic interpersonal style denotes selfishness, callousness, and the remorseless use of others. People high in this trait are characterized by shallow emotional lives, superficial charm, manipulativeness, and a lack of empathy. So she got 100% on that, and I think that's well deserved. Psychopathic lifestyles, this is one she got 75% in. Indicates a tendency towards a chronically unstable, antisocial, and socially deviant lifestyle. Other elements of this style include sensation-seeking, irresponsibility, inability to hold a normal job, and or the inability to maintain non-dysfunctional relationships. She got a 75% on that one, which is just right about the threshold for psychopathy, but that was the lowest she was in. And I think this one kind of does make sense that this one is like where she's, just basically like your garden variety psychopath in this one. Like, yeah, she can't hold a job. Yeah, she can't maintain a healthy relationship, but she did get through law school, so, not totally antisocial there. So, and then overt antisocial features, which she got 88% on, includes reactive anger, criminality, and a lack of impulse control. The likelihood is low that people who rate high in this dimension will mend their ways. Oof. Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to see Wendi changing, right? Right? Yeah. Total psychopathy denotes the person's total psychopathy score. Individuals in the 75 to 100% range are considered psychopaths on the psychopathy checklist. Individuals with the scores below 75% are not. Wow, that was a really fun exam. It'd be kind of fun to run this through with somebody else too, but I think you can kind of see, like, you really kind of have to have a good sense of this person. Like, I think we just, like, barely had enough sense of Wendi, and it would be great if we had more. Like, if we had, like, another Jeff Lacoste type person that had dated her. I mean, I think that's too much to ask for. But I mean, the other person that, you know, sort of gives a lot of different insights is Tamara Demko. I guess we didn't really mention her a whole lot in this video specifically, but I think a lot of her interactions with Wendi, aren't of the same character as somebody that knew her more intimately, like Jeffrey Lacoste. That's interesting. I need to really listen to Tamara Demko. I've only listened to hers probably like 2 or 3 times, whereas I've listened to Jeffrey Lacoste's like 10. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you made it this far, holy hell, what are you doing with your life? Really appreciate your time and attention, and thanks for checking out the channel. As I said, greatly appreciate any support for the channel. Subscribes, we're almost to 1,000. I mean, holy heck. And you know, if you want to post the videos on Reddit or share with your friends, that'd be great. I really appreciate your time, and let me know what you think in the comments. Bye bye.